In the comments under my last Poppy Playtime Chapter 5 video, you asked for one thing, a giant prototype. So today, we're building it. This is easily one of the most epic and challenging projects I've ever made on the channel. So subscribe and smash that like button, because this build was insane. I started with some serious planning. I had to gather a huge number of parts, and I spent about 3 days just working on the concept and figuring out the proportions. The most important thing for me was getting the legs right. They had to look really cool. This was the first leg I built, but when I compared it to the torso, it turned out to be too small. So I built a new, bigger version. This one will be my main reference, although I'll still modify it a bit later because I didn't have enough parts to build 6 legs exactly like this. I experimented a lot during the process, but in the end I was really happy with the result. While building the leg, I used a lot of these joints, but very quickly I realized I didn't have enough of them. So I had to rebuild part of the leg and reuse the mechanism from my first, smaller prototype. This is the structure I came up with for the legs, and honestly I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. Now I'm rebuilding the second left leg so they match. And here's the chaos behind the scenes. I kept going back to this pile over and over again just to find the right tiny piece. This build is seriously complicated, so don't forget to leave a like. Now the mission was simple: repeat this 6 times, and somehow make sure I actually had enough parts. But during the build I kept running into the same problem. I was constantly running out of pieces, so I decided to build the legs in pairs. All the legs are slightly different, but each pair is identical. And these are the legs I ended up with, but getting here already took me 2 full days. Honestly, it's surprising. At first the project didn't seem that complicated, but everything turned out to be much slower than I expected. Alright, now let's move on to the jester part. And of course, we'll start with the arms. I actually came up with the design pretty quickly. Compared to the legs, these were much easier to build. I used parts that we've seen many times in mech armors. For the forearm bones, I used this kind of construction. It was already pretty strong, but I decided to reinforce it a little more with these simple gray pieces. Now the arm is locked in place really securely, and nothing should fall off. A very solid mechanism. I built the arms mostly from parts taken from different mech armors. There are plenty of those, and this is the arm we ended up with. Repeating it was actually pretty easy, and luckily I had enough parts. I know some of you might have trouble finding pieces like these for the fingers. I even thought about painting them, but honestly, I think it looks good just the way it is. Lego builds are never perfectly clean anyway, so we'll keep the black palm, white fingers, and grey claws. And honestly, it still looks really awesome. Alright, let's keep going. Next up is the torso. It's really important to get the proportions right, so the whole body looks balanced. I built this basic frame for it first. The design of the front and back panels I'll figure out later. Right now my main goal is to assemble the entire model, keep the proportions correct, and make the structure strong enough so nothing falls apart. For example, at first the arms weren't holding very securely, so I added an extra plate, and now they're locked in place and definitely won't fall off. It's always a good idea to think about extra reinforcement when you're building something like this. On the back, I attached this panel and connected it to a few joints. These joints will then connect to the main body, where all 6 legs will be attached. At this stage, I'm roughly figuring out the proportions of the figure. I attached everything to this platform for now. It's just a temporary test setup. I'll definitely be reworking a lot of things here later. With builds like this, it's really important to constantly check the proportions. I've had situations before where I built really cool arms, but then the legs turned out too short. Or the opposite. Huge, massive legs, but the arms looked ridiculously tiny. That's why it's always better to assemble the whole figure together as early as possible. For the front panel, I won't go into the full building process here because it's actually a pretty simple mechanism. And this is the basic figure we ended up with so far. It turned out huge. It doesn't even fit into my usual camera frame anymore. But honestly, it already looks really cool. As you can see, the prototype has this very strange shape on the back, so I had to recreate it. To do that, I used these wheels placed on a classic cross-axle. Then, with the help of this joint, I set the correct angle for the back section. Now the proportions are already starting to look pretty good. Unfortunately, the figure turned out to be very heavy, and the legs are barely able to support its weight. So it probably won't be the most convenient figure to actually play with. And if I want to display it on a shelf, I'll most likely need to make some kind of stand. But honestly, that's not a big problem. Anyway, let's keep moving. Now I'm building the base for the rib cage and the body. This is where the rib cage will eventually be attached. Next, I'm adding these structural ribs that the prototype has. Little by little, the whole body is coming together. It might look fast in the video, but in reality, this part takes a lot of time. Alright, now let's move on to the front design of the body. Here I use some regular pieces that I had left over from Wolverine and different mech armors. And this is where the head will be attached later. We'll make it separately out of clay. For the head, I used air-dry clay. It's a bit higher quality than the light modeling clay I usually use, the kind that dries and turns into a light, foam-like material. This one is real clay that you can use to make much more detailed sculptures. It can crack a little while drying, but overall it allows you to create much more interesting shapes. I don't have much experience working with this type of clay, but it actually turned out pretty well. The sculpting itself took about an hour. Luckily, I do have some experience working with other clays and modeling materials. But the main downside of this clay is that once it dries, the head becomes pretty heavy and fragile. So if it falls, some pieces could easily chip off. And in general, because the whole figure is so heavy, it's not the most convenient thing to actually play with. It's more of a display piece, something that looks great standing on a shelf. For the back section, I'm using the light air clay we already know. It dries quickly and can be removed from the Lego parts later without much trouble. First, I build a simple base, a foundation that I'll later cover with fur. Then I added a few small details, just so the build wouldn't look empty. Here I was simply checking how everything looked together, testing the proportions, and making sure everything fit the way I wanted. After that, I left the whole build to dry. And the next day, it was finally time to cover it with fur. At first, my plan was to put a piece of paper over the surface, trace the shape, and then cut the right piece from the sock using that template. But then I had a much simpler idea. I could just cut off the foot part of the sock and pull the remaining part right over the figure. Honestly, it turned out even better than I expected. Now all that's left is to glue it in place, and it will look perfect. Honestly, this idea saved me a lot of effort. Just a few drops of glue, press it down, and it dries almost instantly. Amazing. I love moments like this, when a simple idea suddenly appears and saves a huge amount of time and energy during a build. At first, I thought this step would be a nightmare, but it actually turned out to be super easy. Now it's time to make the rib cage. At first, I planned to build the rib cage using some Lego constructions like these, but honestly, I didn't really like how it looked. It felt a bit too simple and boring. So I decided to make it from the same clay I used for the head, which is drying right now. Originally, I wanted to sculpt each rib individually like this, but the clay doesn't hold thin shapes very well, it just starts to fall apart. So instead, I decided to make one solid plate, which I'll later paint with acrylics. I attached the clay directly onto a Lego piece, so when it dries we get a solid custom part that fits perfectly into the rib cage spot. In a way, I'm basically creating my own unique Lego piece.
Ta-da! That's nice.
The next day, the head finally dried, and now it's time to make the jester hood.
What you look like.
Wrong side.
First, I made 3 pieces for the hat, the tips of the jester hood. When you work with very thin shapes, this clay tends to crack, so doing delicate details with it turned out to be pretty challenging. Still, it's definitely possible. But for future complex projects, I'll probably switch to a special plastic clay that becomes solid plastic after baking. By this time, the rib cage had dried, so I carefully sanded it using sandpaper and a nail file to smooth everything out. After cleaning it up, I applied white acrylic paint as a primer. I also coated the head with the same paint as a base layer because the final colors stick much better on a white surface. Now let's move on to the arms. On the prototype, we can see the arms of Kissy Missy, Huggy Wuggy, and Mommy Longlegs sticking out. At first, I decided to mount them on thin metal wires and sculpt the arms themselves using the light air clay we've used before. I started with Mommy Longlegs, and once again, one of the biggest challenges with this clay is working on tiny details. So this part took a bit of patience. For the arms of Huggy Wuggy and Kissy Missy, my original idea was to shape them from some half-dried leftover air clay and then wrap them with fabric, basically covering them like this and gluing the fabric on top. But in the end, I decided to make the arms from Lego instead. I didn't really like how the fabric version turned out. Still, I wanted to show this idea, just in case you might want to try making them from fabric instead of Lego. So in the end, I ended up with these little clay sausages, which I left to dry. After some time, the arms had dried, and I started making the palms from the same light air clay. But as I mentioned earlier, I'll redo these arms later and rebuild them from Lego pieces. For now, let's move on to the next stage, painting the head. Next day, the primer had dried, and it was finally time to start painting. This was probably one of the most creative parts of making the head. I struggled with it quite a bit and wasn't always sure what the best way to paint it was. Sometimes it was hard to apply the paint in thin, clean layers, so I had to fix a few spots along the way. But in the end, I'd say I'm pretty happy with the result. It was actually pretty challenging to paint multiple layers without accidentally getting paint all over the surrounding parts. Maybe it would have been smarter to make the head removable from the hood so I could paint the hood separately. But I did it the way I did it. In my case, it's almost a single piece. Because of that, there was always a big risk of accidentally dripping paint onto the head. So I had to work very carefully, touching up the tricky spots with a marker when needed. For the yellow eye, I used a small piece of air clay and simply glued it in place. I think it turned out really nice. I also decided to make the little bells from air clay. I shaped 3 small pieces and attached them to the ends of the hood. Here you can see how I carefully touch up the hood with a marker in the areas where there's a risk of dripping paint onto the head and ruining the whole build. The head turned out pretty well, but it does have one serious weakness. If it falls, these tips might break off. By this point, the pieces had already dried, so I glued them in place. They could stay on their own, but not very securely. Then I painted them gold so everything would match better. After the paint dried, I added small black crosses with a marker. Now the tips look like real little bells, just like on the prototype. Next, I moved on to painting the rib cage. This part is pretty simple. Just black acrylic paint, carefully filling in all the holes and cracks. Alright, now the only thing left is the arms. I actually like the Mommy Longlegs arm, but the Huggy Wuggy and Kissy Missy arms like this, I really don't like them, especially compared to how cool the main prototype figure turned out. So just like I mentioned earlier, I decided to rebuild those arms using Lego instead. Luckily, I already had a Huggy Wuggy arm ready. I've actually made 2 videos about that figure before. In the first one, I simply built the figure. And in the second, more recent video, I turned that Huggy Wuggy into the damaged version from the game. If you haven't seen those videos yet, make sure to check them out. Basically, I'm using the same construction again, but this time for Kissy Missy's arm. And honestly, these arms look much better and cleaner than the ones I tried to make from fabric. This is how they will attach to the prototype, and it should work without any problems. And now it's time for the final assembly. Let's put everything together and see what we've built. This project turned out huge and honestly pretty exhausting. I spent about 4 full days working on it, so make sure to leave a like. After that, I ran into a small problem. Attaching the head, I had to struggle with it a bit, but in the end, everything fell into place the way it should. And here he is, our prototype. So much work. but I think it turned out really awesome. Let's take a closer look at the final result and see if all that time and effort was worth it. As for stability, there are a few issues. The figure is pretty heavy, so I made a platform for it to stand on. You can see it right here in the frame. And now our prototype goes onto the shelf, at least until the day comes when I might need some of its parts for future projects.
By the way, this is what my voice sounds like without the 10% speed up, which for some reason has become a classic on my channel. Let me know which one you like more, my normal voice or the faster version. Please write in the comments. It's really important for me. Thank you.
Guys, leave a like, write in the comments what you think, and tell me what you'd like to see in the next video. Give me some inspiration. Thanks everyone for watching. See you in the next video. Bye.